Welcome to part two of my series on interpreting Jesus. And in part one, we looked at the beginnings of different forms of scholarship when it comes to interpreting Jesus' message. Now here we'll be discussing the parables of Jesus, and we're going to continue our discussion for part one regarding the parables of Jesus and the historical Jesus. Now, when comparing the question for Jesus' parables with the quest for the historical reason raises a fundamental question, which is, in order to understand the parables, we have to have some understanding of Jesus' ministry. But how do we determine this? How can we read the parables without acknowledging them as part of a larger strategy that led to Jesus' execution? Even when we agree upon a criteria for determining the authenticity of Jesus' sayings, this larger question looms. And the key issue is not the reconstruction of a complete framework, but the retention of this mindset when we evaluate any piece of tradition, be it a saying or a parable. All perception requires a paradigm without which individual events are just random collections of unrelated data. And if there is no paradigm accentuated, then the interpreter substitutes their own plausibility articulated paradigm. And even when this is seemingly absent, this paradigm about the underlying vision of Jesus' public work shapes the interpretation of Jesus' parable. Same as with interpretations, paradigms vary wildly. For example, Jeremiah sees Jesus as a hybrid between a rabbi and a Christian theologian. Kenneth Bailey sees him as a peasant poet. John Dominic Crossan sees him as an apocalyptic poet communicating through metaphors. Dan Villa sees him as an existentialist philosopher through his use of comic and tragic stories and so on. Now, a brief examination of just this list shows that the model used to interpret Jesus remains a contemporary one, and perhaps the interpreter's reserve clarifying this gestalt between Jesus' ministry and his parables is derived from a fear of what its anachronistic character would reveal. And this is not a new dilemma. Schweitzer recognized it in the gospel narratives. By the time the Jesus tradition was codified into a narrative, it had already been formed in ways that made it impossible to use for the purpose of reconstructing any whole image of Jesus' public activity. Its oral prehistory assured that it would present gaps that could not be closed. Of course, all of this is completely denied by Christian apologists. It's out of sight, out of mind, but that doesn't make this problem go away. Much of Jesus' activity remains an irrecoverable mystery, which is now replaced by a theological reading of his life and death that conceals as much as it reveals. Yet the mystery remains because it can't be explained away by dogmatic, revisionist versions of events. And as long as this mystery lingers, it continues to tantalize readers. So, how can we construct a paradigm wherein its elements render its construction impossible, thereby allowing us to see without any interpretive lens? Albert Schweitzer's answers were straightforward. Quote, "With historical imagination, there is really no other means of arriving at the order and interconnection of the facts of Jesus and the making and testing of hypotheses." End quote. In this light, every study of the parables of Jesus had entailed a hidden act of historical imagination, in which the interpreter conjured an image of Jesus' ministry in order to construe the parables. Still, the hidden hypothesis that governed the visible interpretation was not examined or was covert. Now, this analysis unsettles the popular image of what is involved in historical research. We are led to believe that the historical painstakingly collects data, and after careful and objective analysis, he assembles the bit of information to form a larger whole. If this were the case, then any picture of Jesus' total work should grow out of an empirical search for the pieces and objective evaluation of each one. This implicit model guided a number of searches for the historical Jesus or his historical parables. And this assumes the possibility of an objective researcher and an impartial analyst of facts, which Schweitzer exposed as really an impossibility. It's more likely that inquiry begins the opposite way. One starts out with a theory, not with the facts, and with a paradigm in place, and not with a blank slate, and with an agenda, perhaps a hidden one, and not from a neutral position. And then they go into the text. Now, the task of historical inquiry is to test the feasibility of the originating hypothesis, rather than to confirm the outcome hidden at the start of the project, which covertly controls its subsequent course before emerging as an assured result at its close. When John Geiger wrote his groundbreaking work on the usefulness of the social sciences for New Testament studies, he argued that these frameworks created new facts and allowed us to see new significance in data we had overlooked because we either did not see it or we deemed it insignificant. This paradigm shift in how research is conducted suggests that historians inevitably use contemporary models to understand the past. When we keep this in mind, we understand that while the narratives have existed for centuries, their interpretation and their meaning has changed. Aramaic phrases translated into Greek sound foreign to us when we try to understand them with our 21st century American ears. The stark reality is that we cannot know who the historical Jesus was with certainty. We can only try to piece together bits and pieces of evidence about who others said he was, and we can try to make an educated guess about his identity and his message. Now, why is this important, you may ask? Why did I make this series? Well, I made it because oftentimes we fail to recognize that the Jesus we find is one inconsistent with our own predisposition. It's a Jesus that checks off the boxes on all of our doctrines, and a Jesus who endorses our way of life and our value system. Now, is this the historical Jesus? Possibly, but more likely, possibly not. The big failure I see in conservative Christianity today is that Jesus is presented in sermons, Bible studies, and hymns as a certainty, someone who we know everything we need to know about, and no further inquiry is necessary. On the contrary, this is discouraged. Now, this is problematic because not only does it keep people uninformed and manipulated, but it doesn't do justice to the faith the church is supposed to have. Faith and doubt are two sides of the same coin. If one does not question faith and does not find something that is worthwhile believing in, all we are left with are fairy tales. Fairy tales and admonitions to just believe without thinking about things. To me, they're no longer acceptable. I would rather welcome honest uncertainty than dishonest certainty. Faith without a historical basis is nothing more than imagination and wishful thinking. Faith founded on history is no longer faith, but is fact. Now, do people modernize Jesus? Yeah. Should we modernize Jesus? Well, I think that depends. So long as we can identify a historical basis for Jesus' stands or message on certain issues which turn out to transcend time and are applicable today, we should modernize him. But if we have no historical basis for doing so, what we are doing is we're merely seeking to legitimize our own convictions through an authority figure. And we are presenting this message as if it has withstood the test of scholarship and the test of time, which is not the case. Now, how does this play out in real life, in my experience, for example? Why is interpreting Jesus such a big deal? Why did I make this video series? Well, because every election time, Christians are pestered to vote for God's party and God's values. And you would almost seem to assume that Jesus marches in pro-life rallies, he votes straight ticket Republican, he has 8 guns and a machete courtesy of his NRA membership, and he enjoys a sunny weekend getaway in Cabo courtesy of the tax break he got on his yacht. Now, maybe that was Jesus' message. I mean, it is true, but to me it sounds a lot like some of the conservatives in my church. And well, where's the history in that? Where is the fact in that? How can I place my faith in something that cannot be proven? And I think it's better that we ask ourselves these questions. as opposed to ignoring them.